Ryan Buell was the most personal paranormal investigator that cable television ever produced. Not the most famous, not the most technically skilled, the most personal. The one whose relationship to the work was not professional or performative or driven by the specific kind of ambition that the entertainment industry generates in the people it selects. He investigated because something had happened to him that he needed to understand. He built Paranormal State from that need, turned it into one of the most watched paranormal investigation series in the history of A&E, and created a connection with his audience that went beyond anything the format of the show could fully explain. And then, in the years after the cameras stopped, what happened to Ryan Buell became the kind of story that the show he built was never equipped to tell. It is more complicated than what most people know, more painful than what has been reported, and more human than anything Paranormal State ever captured on camera. If you have been wondering what really happened to him, stay until the end. This is the complete story. Paranormal State premiered on A&E on December 3rd, 2007. The premise was unlike anything the paranormal investigation genre had previously produced. Not a team of professional investigators traveling to famous haunted locations. A college club, the Penn State Paranormal Research Society, founded by Ryan Buell while he was a student at Pennsylvania State University, investigating cases submitted by ordinary people experiencing things they could not explain in their own homes. The intimacy of that premise was what made the show different from everything that preceded it. Ghost Adventures investigated landmarks. Ghost Hunters investigated historic properties. Paranormal State went into the homes of people who were frightened and desperate and had nowhere else to turn. And Ryan Buell walked through those doors not as a television host, but as a person who understood what it meant to need answers that the ordinary world was not providing. The cases the show investigated were not selected for their entertainment potential in the standard sense. They were selected because the people experiencing them were genuinely suffering. Families that had stopped sleeping, children who refused to enter specific rooms, adults who had exhausted every conventional explanation and were left with something they could not name. Ryan Buell treated every one of those situations with a seriousness that the show's critics sometimes mocked, and that its audience recognized as the only appropriate response. He was not performing concern, he was concern. The distinction was visible in every frame of every episode, and it built a connection with the audience that outlasted the show by years, and that made what subsequently happened to him feel, to the people who had watched those 7 seasons, like something that had happened to someone they knew. That quality of genuine personal investment was not manufactured for television. It came from somewhere specific in Ryan Buell's own history, from experiences he had before the cameras arrived and before the Penn State Paranormal Research Society existed, from the specific kind of childhood that produces a person who builds a paranormal investigation organization in college not as a hobby, but as a framework for understanding something that happened to him when he was young, and that he has spent his entire adult life trying to make sense of. Before you can understand what happened to Ryan Buell after Paranormal State, you need to understand what happened to him before it. And that story begins long before any camera ever followed him into any haunted house. Ryan Daniel Buell was born on June 8, 1984 in Corry, Pennsylvania, a small city in the northwestern corner of the state, whose character is shaped by the specific isolation of rural western Pennsylvania. He grew up in an environment that was not unusual by the measures that childhood is typically assessed: family, school, the ordinary social architecture of a small American city. What was not ordinary was what he experienced as a child that he has described in various public accounts across the years since Paranormal State brought his name to a national audience. He has spoken about an encounter in his childhood home that he has characterized as his first contact with something he could not explain, a presence, something that was aware of him in the specific way that the paranormal research community describes as intelligent haunting rather than residual activity, not a sound or a shadow or an ambiguous sensation, something that he experienced as directed, as aware, as specifically interested in him, rather than simply occupying the same space. He has also spoken more carefully and more rarely about what he describes as a demonic presence that attached itself to him during his childhood, and that he believes has followed him across his adult life in ways that his public history makes difficult to dismiss entirely as metaphor or delusion. The specific character of that belief, the consistency of it across years of public statements, the way it shaped every investigation he conducted on Paranormal State, and the role it played in the specific crises that his post-show years produced is the thread that runs through the entire story of what happened to Ryan Buell. You cannot understand the collapse without understanding the conviction that preceded it. And the conviction began in a childhood bedroom in Corey, Pennsylvania, with something that looked at him and that he has spent every year since trying to understand. He arrived at Penn State in 2002 with that conviction intact and with the specific purposefulness of a person who has organized their educational choices around an unresolved personal experience rather than a career calculation. He studied broadcast journalism, a choice that in retrospect reads as the preparation of a person who intended to document something rather than simply investigate it. He founded the Penn State Paranormal Research Society in 2001, before he was even enrolled as a student, which means the organization preceded the university affiliation rather than emerging from it. That sequence matters. It tells you that the investigation was already underway before the institutional framework existed to contain it. Penn State did not produce the PRS. Ryan Buell produced the PRS and then brought it to Penn State. The distinction is the whole story of what kind of person he was before the cameras arrived. Paranormal State ran for 7 seasons between 2007 and 2011, 128 episodes, more than 3 years of continuous production during which Ryan Buell and the core members of the Penn State Paranormal Research Society, Sergei Poboreski, Heather Taddy, Chad Kalick, Elfie Torres, and Katrina Weidman, traveled to cases across the country and documented investigations whose emotional weight exceeded anything the standard paranormal investigation format had previously attempted to carry. The cases were real. The families were real. The suffering was real. And the person walking through those doors and taking responsibility for what happened next was a person in his early to mid-20s who had no professional framework for managing the cumulative psychological weight of what he was absorbing across 128 episodes of other people's fear and pain. The show demanded something from Ryan Buell that nobody in the production, and possibly nobody who watched it, fully calculated in advance. The Ghost Hunters cast could process their investigations through a professional framework that maintained a certain distance between the investigator and the investigated. They were experts brought in to assess a situation. Paranormal State operated differently. Ryan Buell was not assessing. He was engaging. He was sitting with families at their kitchen tables and listening to what had happened to them, and then spending the night in their homes attempting to confront whatever had made those families afraid. The emotional proximity of that approach, repeated across 7 seasons and 128 cases, produced an accumulation that the young man carrying it was not equipped to manage, and that the production schedule gave him no space to process. The people who worked alongside him during the show's production have described the toll in terms that are consistent across different sources and different levels of closeness to the situation, an intensity that increased rather than normalized with exposure, a relationship to the work that became more consuming rather than more manageable as the seasons progressed, a personal life that the demands of continuous production and the specific psychological weight of the cases made increasingly difficult to maintain, and a health situation that was developing beneath the surface of the show's production in ways that the cameras never documented and that Ryan Buell was not yet ready to disclose publicly. In 2012, the year after Paranormal State concluded its run, Ryan Buell publicly disclosed that he had been diagnosed with pancreatic cancer. The announcement reached an audience that had spent 7 seasons watching him walk into haunted houses and confront things that frightened other people, and that was not prepared for the news that the person who had done all of that was facing something that made every paranormal encounter he had ever investigated feel manageable by comparison. Pancreatic cancer carries a specific weight in public understanding. It is the diagnosis that public figures receive and that produces a particular quality of silence in the people who hear it, because the statistics associated with it are not the statistics of a manageable illness. They are the statistics of something that redefines the timeline of a life. He went public with the diagnosis in a way that was consistent with everything about how he had approached Paranormal State, directly, personally, without the managed distance that public figures typically deploy when disclosing medical information. He told his audience what he knew and what he did not know, and what he was facing in the same voice he had used to tell them about the cases and the families and the investigations. The audience that received that disclosure was not a casual one. These were people who had watched 7 seasons of a show built on Ryan Buell's willingness to be genuinely present with other people's suffering. The news that he was now the one facing something he needed to get through produced a response from that audience that reflected exactly the connection the show had built. What followed in the years after the diagnosis was not a straightforward narrative of treatment and recovery. It was more complicated than that, in ways that the public record addresses partially, and that the people who were close to him during those years address carefully. The health situation developed in ways that intersected with other dimensions of his life that were also under pressure. Financial difficulties whose specific character the public record documents in ways that are impossible to address without acknowledging the dimension of his story that his audience found most difficult to process. The years between 2012 and 2016 represent the most painful chapter of Ryan Buell's public history, and the chapter that his audience has had the most difficulty making sense of. The cancer diagnosis had generated an outpouring of support and a specific kind of attention from the people who had followed his work. What that attention revealed, as it continued across those years, was a situation more complicated than a person managing a serious illness with the support of a devoted audience. There were events tickets sold for speaking engagements and paranormal events that did not occur as promised. There were refund situations that were not resolved in the ways that the people who had purchased tickets expected. There were public communications that raised questions about the relationship between the health situation being described and the events being organized. And there were legal consequences whose documentation entered the public record in ways that the audience who had supported him found deeply disorienting. The people who have tried to understand what happened during those years have arrived at explanations that are not mutually exclusive, and that together probably come closer to the truth than any single account does individually. A health situation that was genuine and that produced real crisis. A financial situation that the collapse of the show's income stream and the medical costs created. A psychological state shaped by years of paranormal investigation whose cumulative weight had never been properly processed, and the specific vulnerability of a person whose public identity had been built entirely around helping other people through crisis and who had no established framework for navigating his own. Ryan Buell had spent 7 seasons being the person other people called when they did not know where else to turn. When he needed that himself, the architecture of who he had built himself to be publicly made it genuinely difficult to ask for it directly. Katrina Weidman was among the core members of the Penn State Paranormal Research Society who appeared on Paranormal State across its full run. She has continued working in paranormal investigation since the show ended, most notably as a lead investigator on Portals to Hell, and she has spoken about Ryan Buell in public contexts that reflect both genuine care for him as a person and the specific difficulty of watching someone you worked alongside closely and respected deeply navigate the kind of collapse his post-show years produced. Her account of what those years were like from the perspective of someone who knew him well enough to understand the distance between the person the audience saw and the person managing what was actually happening is one of the more honest, publicly available records of what Ryan Buell's situation looked like to the people closest to it. She has described a person whose genuine qualities, the care, the commitment, the specific kind of courage required to do the work Paranormal State did in the way it did it, were real and remained real even through the most difficult years. And she has described the specific heartbreak of watching those genuine qualities coexist with the decisions and the situations that made those years so painful for the people who had invested in him and believed in what he was doing. That coexistence, the real person alongside the genuine failures, is the most honest available frame for understanding Ryan Buell's story, and the one that his audience deserves to hold, rather than the simpler version that either fully condemns or fully excuses what happened. The public record of Ryan Buell's health situation across the years since the initial cancer disclosure is complicated by the gap between what was communicated publicly and what was verifiable medically. What has emerged over time, from his own subsequent disclosures and from reporting that engaged seriously with the available documentation, is a picture that includes genuine health struggle whose specific character was not always accurately described in the public communications that accompanied it. He has spoken more recently about addiction as a dimension of what those years involved, about the specific way that the intersection of health crisis, financial pressure, public scrutiny, and the psychological weight of the post-show years produced a situation in which the decisions he made were not the decisions a person making them from a stable foundation would make. That framing is not an excuse. He has not offered it as one. It is a description of a human situation that is more common than the public record of it suggests, and that in Ryan Buell's specific case was shaped by factors whose accumulation was genuinely unusual. 7 seasons of absorbing other people's suffering. A health crisis whose reality was genuine even when its communication was complicated. A financial collapse whose causes were multiple and whose consequences were real. And a public identity built around strength and presence and the willingness to confront things that other people could not face, that made genuine vulnerability almost structurally impossible to express directly. Ryan Buell has not disappeared. He has continued to engage with the audience that Paranormal State built, in formats that reflect a person navigating recovery, rather than a person who has returned fully to the professional life the show represented. He has been open, in the specific way that has always characterized his public communication, about the dimensions of what those years involved and about where he is now in relation to them. The openness is still there. The specific quality of presence that made Paranormal State feel different from every other paranormal investigation show is still visible in the ways he engages with the people who have continued to follow his story, even through the years that made following it difficult. What is genuinely heartbreaking about Ryan Buell's story is not the collapse. Collapses happen to people. They happen for reasons that are understandable when the full picture is available, and that do not erase what the person was before them or what they are working toward after. What is heartbreaking is the specific trajectory, the person who built a show out of going toward other people's pain, who did it because he understood that pain from the inside in ways that made him uniquely equipped to be present with it, and who then found himself in a situation where the cumulative weight of all of it came due in a way that he was not equipped to carry alone. The audience that loved Paranormal State loved it because Ryan Buell was genuinely present with people who needed someone to be present with them. The heartbreaking part is that when he needed that himself, the framework he had built did not make it easy to receive. He gave the show everything, and the path back from what that cost him has been longer and harder than anything he ever investigated. Subscribe now for more stories like this one. There is a dimension of Ryan Buell's legacy that the public narrative of his post-show years has consistently overshadowed, and that deserves to be named directly in any honest account of what happened to him. Paranormal State changed something in the paranormal investigation genre that has not been changed back. The show established that the people experiencing paranormal events were the center of the story, rather than the evidence the events produced. It established that an investigation could be conducted with genuine emotional intelligence alongside technical methodology. It established that a paranormal investigation show could make its audience feel the weight of what the families being investigated were carrying, rather than simply the excitement of what might be captured on camera. Those contributions to the genre are real, and they are Ryan Buell's, and they exist entirely independently of what happened in the years after the show ended. The investigators who came after Paranormal State and who built shows whose emotional approach reflected what the PRS had demonstrated was possible. Katrina Weidman on Portals to Hell, the cast members who went on to other projects, the broader shift in how paranormal television engaged with the human dimension of the experiences it documented, all of it exists in a landscape that Paranormal State helped shape. Ryan Buell did that, before the diagnosis, before the difficulties, before the years that his audience found so painful to watch. He built something that mattered and that changed the genre, and that the people who were helped by the cases the show investigated remember in terms that have nothing to do with anything that came after. That is the part of his story that the heartbreaking years have made easy to lose sight of, and it is the part that he deserves to have remembered alongside everything else. The question of where Ryan Buell goes from here is one that only he can answer. The path back from what those years produced is not a short one, and it is not a linear one, and the people who have watched it from outside do not have access to the full picture of what it looks like from inside. What is visible is a person who is still here, who is still engaged with the audience that found something real in what he built, who has demonstrated, across the years of navigating one of the more publicly difficult recoveries that paranormal television has produced, the same quality of stubborn presence that made him walk through those doors in the first place. That quality, the willingness to stay present with something painful rather than walk away from it, was what Paranormal State was built on. It is apparently also what Ryan Buell is built on. And it is the most honest thing you can say about what happened to him and where he is now.